Hi, I'm John Owens, and this is my presentation on leisure education and its influences. And so, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this presentation is first, I work for Parks and Recreation for the City of Oakland Park, but I also have an interest in holistic practices. Some of my earlier academic work has been towards spiritual learning, Christian formation, life coaching in the workforce. And so today I wanted to focus a little bit about why leisure is very important. So that's what we're going to explore today. So some basic things you should understand are some definitions. When you look at the word leisure in Greek, the word is skola. It means school. So when you think of school, you don't have to think about it necessarily as this boring thing. It's the idea of leisure. And some of this might be because the ancient Greek philosophers had a lot of free time on their hands to discuss and debate all the issues that they cared about. And so that's kind of a little bit of this idea that leisure leads to some of this. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get to talking about the philosophers. The idea that leisure or recreation means to recreate. It's refreshment of strength and spirits after work. It's a diversion from our normal activities. The best definition comes from Charles Brightbill. Charles Brightbill was considered the founder of leisure education. And he said, leisure then is a block of unoccupied time, spare time, or free time when we are free to rest and do as we choose. Leisure is time beyond that which is required for existence. The things which we must do biologically to stay alive and subsistence. The things we must do to make a living as in work, or prepare to make a living as in school, or pay for what we want done if we do not do it ourselves. Leisure is time for which our feelings of compulsion should be minimal. It is discretionary time, the time to be used according to our own judgment or choice. Now, I just want you to take a minute and think about what are those fun things you love doing on your free time? Is it reading a book? Is it going for a ride in your bicycle? Is it cooking? Is it spending time with your friends? Is it playing a sport? There are many ways to deal with leisure. So, let's talk a little bit about what the ancient Greek philosophers say. We have Socrates, and he said he believed that leisure was necessary in order to produce the time needed for academic discussion and thought. So thinking about like when you're going to coffee and you're having a conversation with a friend about life. That's kind of what the Greek philosophers were doing, but they were doing it on a very kind of deep level. And so that is a form of leisure. Aristotle said it was play is for the sake of work, but while work is for the sake of leisure. So we work, in other words, to be able to do and afford the things we want to do for fun. Play provides relief from work, but it's not life. Instead, leisure is life. Leisure are those things that have meaning to you. Even outside the ancient Greeks, we also have the Bible. And even Jesus himself talked a little bit about having leisure, having a day of rest. And he said that when he was describing in this passage of Mark 6:31, he talked about the idea with his disciples. They were exhausted. They had been doing their healing and work. And he told them, come away and have leisure. And unfortunately, when they got there, they were met with more people and they didn't get time for leisure. But even Jesus recognized it with his own disciples, that leisure was important. The last of the ancients, we have another Greek philosopher, Plato. And Plato included in his idea of education, he wrote this in his Republic document, and he said that music and gymnastics should be included in order to produce a well-rounded person. So if you think about it, you can learn all the science you want, you can learn all the math you want, But in Plato's mind, unless you also know the arts and you also know physical fitness, you're not a well-rounded person. And this was the basis of what classical liberal education was based off on its models. So we're going to move forward and we're going to talk about John Dewey. John Dewey believed that experience occurs continuously because interaction of life, creature, and environing condition is involved in the very process of living. He's a big proponent of this thing that we call experiential education. The fact that our experiences help us learn. And when you think about it, we're always doing things. No matter what, we're always learning as we go. Our interactions, every time we read something, whether we're browsing the internet or when we're conversing with our friends, we're learning as we go. It could be social skills. There could be cognitive skills. There's all sorts of things that are always going as we move along. And that's the basis of experiential learning that John Dewey is talking about. And he also went on to say, education has more serious responsibility than making adequate provision for enjoyment of recreative leisure, but not only for the sake of immediate health, for the sake of lasting habits upon the mind. He believed that leisure was also a very important function and component of how we learn. We also have another term that we talk a lot about in adult learning, which is self-directed learning. The things that we just do on our free time, that we choose to do on our own and just learn. Maybe it's picking up a recipe and trying it out on your own without no formal education or class around it. That's a form of leisure. That's also self-directed learning. And that's experiential learning, because as you do it, you're learning about how things meld in that recipe. And maybe something you could have done more or better, like maybe next time you need to add a pinch of more salt, or maybe substitute the egg with applesauce. There's all sorts of different ways when you're looking at how you're educating and exploring when you're doing fun leisure activities, such as cooking. So then we move forward to Charles Brightbill. Charles Brightbill was considered the founder of leisure education, and most of his influence was based on the works of John Dewey. He said that without leisure, we do not live at all. Think about it. If you were all work and no play, how fun is life? I know that I look forward to my weekends. I look forward to my travel. I look forward to those things. And that's why I work, to be able to do the things I enjoy. Society must provide ways for abundant opportunities of leisure, which ideal to democracy's push for the pursuit of happiness. We talk about it in the we talked about it with Thomas Jefferson and the Founding Fathers, this idea of pursuit of happiness. And this is the basis of democracy. And what he says there is finding abundant opportunities can rest in democracy in all sorts of different ways. The idea of allowing people to be able to assemble, to group, to be able to do those things. And it could be that even within government, how they can facilitate those things. Maybe they facilitate a street fair, or maybe they facilitate the recreational activities at your local park. Maybe you joined a sports program. Maybe you went to a pool. All those things function around helping people achieve happiness, and that's a form of leisure. He goes on to say, leisure education just begins at the home at a very young age, such as motor development, coordination through activities such as dance, sports, and games. Learning to read through good books and inquiring about history. Being of service to others. Those are some of the talking points he talks about we start to develop as little kids through leisure. He goes on to talk about there are certain laws you must have in order to have leisure education. The law of readiness. This is being at the right time. You have to have the time to be able to recreate, or it doesn't exist as leisure. The law of effect holds the individual responsible for the outcome. If you don't have self-motivation to do it, you're probably not enjoying it and therefore you're not going to have the outcomes you wish to have in it. For example, if you decide you want to be a good basketball player, you have to be motivated to practice. And that goes into the law of exercise. And law of exercise talks about that repetitive practice, that you got to keep doing it over and over and over to be good at it. Resourcefulness, and that's thinking and analyzing to play well. So think about it. If you're playing football, you have to have a strategy, and you have to be able to analyze what each team is doing. And that's the idea of resourcefulness. Not everything needs to be organized, and that goes into self-directed learning. It doesn't need to be organized that you're going to pick up a novel this weekend and read it. More time off from the job, there's greater opportunity for us to engage in public affairs. This includes things that revolve around culture and politics, sports, and art. So the more free time we have, the more we can engage in society. And that, as a whole, has a greater impact for the common good. He also goes on to say, leisure education will never be taken seriously until schools quit isolating the arts of leisure as extracurricular activities. The real threat of moral decay centered not in the hours we spend earning our bread. So the idea that it can't be something separate, it's not just an extracurricular activity, but that we should actually include it as a formal class that has equal weight and credit to that science, technology, engineering, math, but that these are equal to, not something extra, and nothing will be taken seriously until we do so. Brightbill goes on to say, how can you teach with enjoyment, for example, botany? Yes, it is about plant life, but how can you also give experiences to students to enjoy the plant life in the outdoors? So it's not enough just to know that there are cells in the plants and how the plant is created, but how do you go out and spend time enjoying the beauty of the creation and really loving how it interacts and creates an ecosystem? And so maybe you involve hiking and those kind of recreational activities that help you create a love for what you do. So there are psychological benefits. I had in my studies, I looked at 4 different research studies that are listed. And in each of these, there showed that there is a great psychological impact to leisure. The fact that when we recreate, we overall are happier. We usually have better mental stability, better physical health, better self-esteem. In addition, people who participate in regular leisure activities have decreased boredom, loneliness, depression, and higher sense of well-being. One of the studies I looked at was in the Healthy Parks study. It was just people who simply went to the parks, who hung out in the green space. And when they did the study, they again found that people were just happier going to parks regularly. And that created just a sense of overall well-being. In another study I looked at, they took 2 rural communities and they looked at people with disabilities and putting recreation as a standard in their health. And they did find again that these people with disabilities were able to again have a better standard of living by having regular leisure activities that got them active outside their own home. It helped with a lot of depression and loneliness that tends to happen when some of these people get isolated, especially in rural communities. On another study, they looked at university settings, and one of the things they saw in the university setting was offering leisure education as a class, and this could be that maybe you took a cooking class or something, but they found that the student, and they didn't make it arbitrary necessarily to do it, but they found the difference between the students that actually took leisure education versus those that didn't. And the ones that took leisure education usually were stressed less. They actually ended up performing better academically, and they had higher self-esteem than those who were just focused on their schoolwork and nothing else. And then the last study I looked at was looking at women in general and how leisure affects them. And again, what we saw were signs in this, looking at 2 different municipalities, that women who partook in municipal programs within a Parks and Rec world actually, again, had better self-esteem, they felt happier, they had better physical health. And so that was a lot. Now, one of the interesting things I did see in that study was that there was also a difference in economic class, because unfortunately, those who were middle class and above had more time to actually be in leisure programs, where you didn't see that as common with lower income people, because they didn't have the money or they worked way too many hours to be able to have leisure. Sociologically, Ronald Rapport, why I chose him as a sociologist was he broke it down in the 70s, and he took leisure studies as a whole, not just looking at it as compartmentalized, and he found some very common elements over leisure education. And he says that it is a product of its culture. Many leisure study professors are also sociologists, and they study how people spend their free time. So he came up with a couple of fields with that, and he said that the first thing is, the definition of leisure is how free time is spent. See, people spend their free time differently. Everyone is different in what their interests are. And he says that there was a diffusion of leisure. So if they enjoyed it, then they go out and get a buddy to do that. And did other people join into that activity? And in a sense, that also created a sense of community. And I'll give it a point, like when I look at my own work in the sports world. At one time, baseball was a very big sport here in Oakland Park. But over time, the community has changed, and there's been a bigger, heavier Latin demographic. And with that sociological change, soccer is now the predominant sport. And soccer is growing and growing and growing. So with culture, changes some of those things. He also pointed out leisure and lifestyles, and this is about how classes of people spend their time. Upper class people like to spend their time sometimes differently than people that are poorer. For example, it's very common for high class people to like to spend time going to the opera and the ballet, or maybe they like to watch the Kentucky Derby and they like to golf. And you don't find that as much common. You may find more common elements in middle class people, and so there is a difference in class and how people spend their time a lot of times together, and it becomes a lifestyle. Imagine when you go and you look at a magazine and you see this glamorous person on a yacht, and you wish you're a part of that, but you know you don't have the means to be out on the yacht because you don't make that kind of money. That's a lifestyle that creates a certain type of leisure for those people. Another thing he pointed out was macro and micro social perspectives. So again, the things that affect leisure are money, time disposal, technology, education, and accessibility. Accessibility being, are there museums around? Are there beaches? What kind of stuff is around in your community that you can actually take a part in? And if you don't have access, if there's no museum in town, you're not getting exposed to that kind of stuff like art per se, or history, or depending on what is around, because it has to be accessible. Technological advances are increased through internet classes and videos. People are always learning how to do new things, especially when you go on YouTube. You can learn how to do anything you want nowadays on YouTube. So the internet becomes a big increase of how people leisure. Got the rise of video games. There's all sorts of ways to interact and do things. The other thing that has also increased is sustainable energy technology for better conservation. You're seeing this a lot in the parks world, where you get more and more facilities that are going out and they're increasing wind energy. And you can see that out at Mills Pond Park, for example, here in Fort Lauderdale. Or you see solar panels that are put up on things. And the parks have always been on the forefront of that. Way before residential units, they kind of introduced this ecological feature, which leads to the trends. Go green. The park system has been very busy in educating the world about conservation and going green. So parks were the first to teach people about recycling, and parks were the first to teach people about sustainable energy programs, and all those things that impact the environment and that we teach in environmental science. A lot of this stuff gets introduced in our park system, and so recreation and outdoor recreation is very much a part of leisure education. The other move that you also see in the leisure world is the move towards evidence-based programs. For example, if you've ever taken part in an exercise class at the gym, more and more exercise is becoming evidence-based, showing that things can work. For example, it's not just enough to have a class for seniors and that focuses on aerobics, but what kind of aerobics are you offering? For example, maybe you're doing an Arthritis Foundation exercise program, learning about movements that really directly affect arthritis. And there's all sorts of different classes that are on there. You got the Live Strong program, which focuses on how to use exercise as a way to get people well through cancer. And there's all sorts of things that target all sorts of different health issues. And so evidence-based programming is becoming a very common feature that you're seeing in the Parks and Recreation world. The last thing that you see specifically in leisure education is the compartmentalizing and managementizing of subfields. So people don't talk about leisure studies anymore. People talk about sports management, music management. You can break it down into art. You can break it down into dance. And people look at their own fields. One of the biggest increases you're seeing in the world right now is actually the topic of sports. You can see sociology of sports, and you see sports management. So this idea that these subfields are all doing it. Now, what's interesting, if you really want to take it a step further academically, is to look at all these subfields and say, what do they all have in common? Which goes back to that 1974 report that we talked about as leisure as a whole, because I'm sure you can find common elements between sports and outdoor education and recreation and music and dance and cooking. There's got to be, in tourism even, that's another really big bolstering field in leisure these days. Common elements. So I just want to leave you just with one quick thought, and that thought is, think about what are some of the fun things you have learned this year, and what are those things that you learned without necessarily taking a formal class for a degree, but just for fun? Did you take part in a sports program? Did you learn how to build something this year? Remember, when you do these things, that's leisure education. Thank you.